We're going to give everyone another minute, minute and a half to roll in. So just register as a forecaster if you've not done so already. And if you have more time still, just go ahead and read the paper. Wonderful. Let's get started. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the CSET webinar on how crowd forecasting can inform policy. My name is Michael Page. I'm a CSET Research Fellow and the lead investigator of Foretell, CSET's pilot project on crowd forecasting. Our featured speaker today is CSET's founding director, Jason Matheny. We'll hear from Jason in a moment, but first, some housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted, and if you're joining by a computer, we can't see you. If you have a question, please type it in the chat. We'll reserve the last 20 minutes or so for questions. And those who are phoning in for this meeting will not be able to ask questions, and we thank you for understanding the technical limitations here. All right, back to substance. Before founding CSET, Jason was the Assistant Director of National Intelligence and the Director of IARPA, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity. Before IARPA, he worked at Oxford University, the World Bank, the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, the Center for Biosecurity, and Princeton University. He was also the co-founder of 2 biotechnology companies. While at IARPA, Jason led the groundbreaking Aggregative Contingent Estimation, also known as ACE, forecasting project, which, as all super forecasting fans know, was won by the University of Pennsylvania's Good Judgment Project, led by professors Philip Tetlock and Barbara Mellers. Jason, thanks for joining us. I'd love to use this time to discuss with you your interest in and experience with crowd forecasting as a tool for improving government decision-making, including practical obstacles and what you think the ideal decision-making processes would look like. I'd also like to discuss CSET's pilot forecasting project, Foretell, and an issue brief published today on how at Foretell we're using crowd forecasting to inform policy. And as I mentioned, we'll reserve the last 20 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So in the mythologized timeline of crowd forecasting, there's Galton's ox in 1906, the statistician at the county fair who learned that the attendees at the county fair, when their judgments were combined, guessed the weight of the ox spot on. There was the Iowa electronic markets in the 1980s, one of the earliest large-scale prediction markets that predicted the accuracy of presidential elections. And then there was ACE, which you led and started in 2010 to 2015. So it seems like a pretty iconic milestone in the history of forecasting. I'd love to hear more about why you started ACE, what you learned from it, what you found surprising, and what challenges remain. But before we jump right into ACE, I'd like to talk a bit about the problem that you wanted to solve with ACE. And so maybe to dig into that, I'd like to get your views on how are decisions made in the US government? And I know the answer might be different in different parts of the US government, so feel free to break it down however you like. What tools are people currently using, whether forecasting tools or otherwise, and how can we improve upon that?
Thanks, Michael. And I should check just by making sure that I've got this right, because I'm an AV idiot. And even 7 months into a pandemic, I feel like I still don't understand Zoom. Is everything okay?
On my end, yes.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll forget about the others. I'm just really happy to talk with you today, Michael. And thanks for setting up.
Yeah, if it's just the two of us, so be it. We can send out the recording afterward.
Great. Perfect. Yeah. So I think what got me, first, what got me interested in this, I can sort of provide the explanation of how I got interested in forecasting, but I think the current state of practice in the government on forecasting is not dissimilar from the current state of practice of forecasting in most organizations, or the way that we provide decision support to most decisions in most organizations, which is that there's not typically a formal process. There's usually an unstructured deliberation by an individual or by a small group. And in the policy world, there's very little use of formal tools for forecasting outside of highly specialized areas, like weather forecasting or monetary policy. So in most areas, we rely on informal judgment. And we know that that's not ideal. I mean, there's been a few decades of research on human judgment that's showed that individuals and deliberating groups are prone to different kinds of errors and biases. A single expert or a small group of experts know less collectively than a much larger group of experts. And if you have a deliberating group, there are various kinds of social pressures to agree with the person who's the most senior or the most charismatic or the most talkative.
I think we might have lost Jason, at least I did. Oh, it's back. Jason, I lost you for a minute. If you could back up about 30 seconds.
Sorry?
You cut out for about 30 seconds. So if you could back up about 30 seconds, you were just talking about how people could be overly influenced by others in the room, charismatic individuals.
Oh yeah, not that ever happens at CSET, but because I'm not charismatic enough to in fact lead to groupthink. But you do see this happening in a lot of organizations where the person who speaks the most or is likely to be the most influential within a group might end up sort of collapsing disagreement. And in some cases, that can lead to sort of catastrophic errors in judgment. And in fact, there's a sort of famous case within the intelligence community of cases where Sherman Kent, who was the chief analyst at CIA, noticed that these sort of vague verbal expressions of probability that were being made by small groups or by individuals were being misinterpreted by readers of intelligence reports. First, that they overestimated the degree of consensus. And second, that because the expression of probability was in language as opposed to numbers, that people simply had a different interpretation than what the authors of the judgments intended. So he did a survey and found that policymakers had interpretations that were wildly different from what the analysts intended. An analyst might have intended likely to mean 30%, whereas a policymaker who read that interpretation thought that it meant 70%. And there were a few cases where this meant that there were like significantly different interpretations from what was intended by the analytic product. And if one misinterprets, for example, the probability assigned to an imminent attack, that policymakers then might make an unnecessary preventive strike. So Kent tried to introduce numerical probability starting in the early 60s to intelligence analysis to prevent those kinds of catastrophic misinterpretations. Not everyone was happy about this, and one of his colleagues accused Kent of turning the CIA into a betting parlor. Sherman Kent responded that he'd much rather be a bookie than a poet, which is how he viewed the vague language in analytic reports. But most analysts just didn't agree with Kent, and for decades, numerical probabilities didn't get much traction. That changed in 2007 when Steve Reber, who was then at ODNI, who's a hero in this sort of whole field of probabilistic forecasting, he brought in Danny Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, to give a lecture to intelligence analysts on how to improve intelligence analysis. And here's a quote from Kahneman at that lecture in 2007. "How does one improve the forecasting of events in a largely unpredictable world? Only by combining large numbers of forecasts, and this should be our strategy. Decision makers should compare their probabilities with many experts' probabilities. We should use aggregates of individual judgments instead of just individual judgments alone, or deliberating group judgments. We should report on the distribution of judgments and outliers, and we should provide incentives for accuracy. So I think that's great advice. I mean, 13 years later, I don't think you could do better than that advice. Back in 2007, Steve Reber then worked with Adam Siegel and his team at Cultivate, who are on the call, to introduce a tool to intelligence analysts to follow Kahneman's advice. And the ACE program that we did at IARPA was really just built on top of the work that Steve and Adam were doing.
Wonderful. So you hit many of the themes I want to discuss today, and can't address all of them at the exact same time, so I'll try to triage. One thing I want to come back to is the resistance you mentioned in the form of turning the CIA into a betting parlor. But before we get into that, you mentioned two different components of the way people had been making these decisions. One related to how people communicate their judgment, and that was whether people use numbers or words. And in principle, I imagine people can use numbers or words, even though the quality or content of their judgment is the same. Independent of that, you mentioned that a common way in which these decisions are made is by relying on informal judgments. What do you mean by that? What is one's informal judgment?
Well, the default is really just to think intuitively about a problem, not to decompose it into a set of smaller questions that you could assign probabilities to. And also the default is not to use numerical probabilities. And I think there's a bunch of different reasons for that. One is most of us are not given any training in how to use numerical probabilities. I know you, Michael, have taken probabilistic calibration courses, and you assign probabilities to things now as a matter of course. That's not intuitive for a lot of people. They're not given training in how to do it. And it isn't even the standard course for intelligence analysts to learn how to assign those types of probabilities. So instead, they rely on informal or unstructured judgment. Now, fortunately, these intelligence analysts are super smart. They process a lot of information. They have access to a lot of information, so we can still make really good judgments. But we're leaving a whole lot of information sort of on the cutting room floor by not delivering numerical probabilities. Again, because of this vague verbal language.
Right. Does the CIA, has it changed its approach to using numbers rather than words?
No, not really. I mean, there's interest in, I think, using the prediction market that Steve and Adam set internally, and there's now thousands of analysts who participate in that. But most analytic products are still using vague verbiage, and in some cases, there's some bureaucratic incentives that work against making precise and falsifiable forecasts. There's this dig that physicists take against each other if they make an unfalsifiable claim, which is you're not even wrong. So if you can't disprove something, that has some attractive features if you're an organization. I think, though, by and large, it's not that there's a sort of bureaucratic dodging for culpability by the intelligence community. It's just that there's so much inertia in writing products the way that we have for decades, and it's really, really hard to steer that bureaucracy in a different direction. Steve, when he started in 2007, I think recognized correctly that this needed to be a grassroots effort, that you needed to start with the analysts and get them interested in these methods, then find a few key policymakers who could serve as your demand signal. And they were very lucky, and we were very lucky in ACE that at the time we had as key leaders in the intelligence community, Jim Clapper, Stephanie O'Sullivan, Robert Cardillo, two very supportive chairs of the National Intelligence Council. I mean, it was really like the sort of ideal leadership for supporting a pretty risky and ambitious idea to see how you could generate and test these probabilistic forecasts. But keeping that going is challenging, and I think one of the humbling aspects of the work that we did in the intelligence community is, even if you show that these methods are really, really accurate, getting long-term buy-in is really hard, and making it stick over generations of senior leaders and policymakers is really going to require that it become the default method. That if you brought somebody some vague verbiage, they would say like, well, what does the prediction market say on this? I mean, that's what we would want the default to be, that people start asking for probabilities. We're not there yet, but I'm keeping hope alive.
Great. I want to return to that as well. As I see it, there are two challenges. One is developing the tools themselves, developing the state of the art, so we know we are getting good information. And the second is actually getting them implemented, which is a cultural problem to some extent, but not entirely. So yeah, I would like to return to that. Before we do, so you mentioned the perfect environment. I assume you're talking about the genesis of ACE and your work with IARPA funding forecasting projects. How did this begin? Why forecasting? Why you? Why in 2010?
So I was interested in forecasting from having worked in public health, and I worked in international health and on infectious diseases, and we made forecasts, and they were usually bad forecasts, and because they were bad forecasts, more people died than should have, and so forecasting for me seemed really consequential, and we still do a really bad job of forecasting in public health. I mean, COVID is one example of that. So I worked for several years trying to improve the quality of disease forecasting, and it seemed as though there were methods that were being used in epidemiology that we knew could outperform other methods when we tested them in sort of forecasting tournaments. And I really like this idea of using tournaments as a way of testing methods against one another. I ended up moving from traditional public health to national security in 2002, when the first virus was synthesized from scratch. And then I became really interested in technology forecasting, because at the time we were sort of trying to figure out how much lead time do we have before we need to develop countermeasures for somebody to recreate smallpox, and so we needed to have some sense of how quickly this technology was moving. Back in 2002, we thought we had probably about 20 years before this approach to synthetic biology would allow an individual actor or a group to synthesize smallpox from scratch. It turns out we were wrong. In 2017, a couple of biologists synthesized a pox virus from scratch for $100,000. And this is another humbling case of, if you get the math wrong, it can have catastrophic outcomes. I mean, fortunately, that technology hasn't been misused yet, but I think it's one for which we're unprepared. So this got me interested in technology forecasting. When I joined the intelligence community at IARPA, my original interest had been in statistical forecasting, because that's what I was accustomed to from epidemiology. But it turns out that for a lot of key intelligence questions, we don't have lots of structured data. We have lots of reports, lots of text. Our machine learning methods back in 2008, when I joined, weren't that great, and so it seemed like the most plentiful data that we had were judgments from intelligence analysts. They weren't always elicited, and they definitely weren't typically elicited in a numerical form, but it was sort of a latent supply of data that was there in a large volume if somebody would just collect it. So I then worked with Steve Reber and with Adam Siegel, and we were very fortunate to get, as part of the ACE program, people like Phil Tetlock and Barb Mellers and Don Moore and Danny Kahneman, Emil Servan-Schreiber. And one thing that I think was sort of motivating for me was, as you pointed out at the beginning, there's this tradition of thinking about taking the average of judgments that goes back to Galton or even to Condorcet before, and we don't pay attention maybe to like the various places in which this averaging principle works. And there's a really fascinating example of this, which is in Tetlock's amazing book, Expert Political Judgment. The main story of that book is about foxes and hedgehogs. But there's a footnote at the end of the book that if you simply took the average of everybody's judgments, it would beat both the foxes and the hedgehogs. So, I mean, even when we've got sort of the data, it's just kind of like an afterthought about this averaging principle. It's so simple, but it works so well across so many different domains. So that idea is really what motivated the ACE program. And again, it was really built on top of the work that Steve and Adam were already doing.
And for those who don't know the fox hedgehog reference, I believe it's from an Isaiah Berlin essay about Tolstoy. It's a very strange origin. And I always get the two animals mixed up. Is it the hedgehog that knows many things and the fox that knows one thing?
Other way around.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if that matters, but what I found interesting is when you look at individuals, knowing many things, not having a grand theory tends to make you more accurate. And the reason is really the exact same reason, as far as I can tell, that the crowd works well. The crowd relies on a diversity of methods and a diversity of information sources. And it turns out that relying on many different things works better than relying on one thing. And so the more people we have, the more we do that. And the more each of those people does that, the more information that we have informing our all things considered judgment. Okay, so sorry for that fox hedgehog rant.
Oh, yeah, it was so helpful. Yeah,
I really do wish we would choose different animals, because I can never keep it straight. So what did you learn from ACE? What was the takeaway?
Yeah, so there were, I mean, at first it was just, it was such a like blissful research experience, because if you get to work with people like Phil and Barb and Adam all in one program, I mean, that's the peak. That's sort of like peak research experience. So the one thing I learned is just that there are amazing social scientists working on really fascinating problems related to human judgment. We were also very lucky to be at IARPA, which had the appetite for a large, ambitious research program that had dozens of different comparison groups and factorial design that was really complicated, and tens of thousands of participants. So it ended up becoming the largest geopolitical forecasting experiment, I think, in history. And we ended up collecting 3 or so million judgments, all of which were scored for accuracy. It's really, there's a book about the program that Phil Tutlock has, and I think one of the successes of the program is
Jason, we lost your audio for a second. You could back up 10 seconds.
Thing that's most valuable, say, about scientific instruments is not that it can make a single discovery, but that it can make multiple discoveries. And that's really what we liked about forecasting tournaments, is you could use it as a microscope for human judgment, but also for AI and machine learning. And we've used these tools now for a variety of different kinds of comparisons for making forecasts. The specific things that we learned in ACE, first, that you could outperform deliberating groups, individual experts, and traditional intelligence products that has classified information behind it, simply by pooling judgments of non-professional but deeply conscientious forecasters. And that was a pretty counterintuitive result, because we spend certainly billions of dollars on classified intelligence collection. And then another surprising result was that you could outperform the average of everybody if you focused on, say, the top 1 or 2% of forecasters by accuracy, and just took the average of their judgment, so the so-called super forecasters. And interestingly, in contrast to sort of the typical regression to the mean, the
Jason, we lost your audio again, so if you could back up 30 seconds when you come to.
Sort of omnivorous need to absorb information, and they sought out information that was disconfirming rather than simply backing up intuitions that they already had. And they scored very well on tests of critical thinking. Hey, Michael, is my audio breaking up? I saw that in a comment, and if so, I can try calling on my phone.
Yeah, so we did lose you just then for about 10 seconds. This happened maybe twice. So actually, yes, maybe if you could just call on your phone, that would be worth a 30-second delay. Why don't you go ahead and do that?
While I do that, so given that I've just described what we did in ACE, and we did not in ACE, though, look at technology forecasts. I wish we had. We later, Dewey and I, Dewey Murdoch, who's also at CSET, he had an outstanding program at IARPA called FUSE, which looked at technology forecasting. Together, we launched a program called Forest, which looked at technology forecasting. But we really laid the groundwork for trying to think about the problems that you're addressing in Foretell. So one of the reasons that I was really excited at CSET to launch the Foretell pilot project is so that we could actually see this sort of merger of geopolitical and technology forecasts, because at least in principle, what's happening geopolitically is affecting what's happening in technology and vice versa. So while I stall in order to make a phone call, can you tell us what's the genesis of Foretell, how you got this started, what are the questions like, how are they structured, and how do these clusters of questions help us to inform key technology and geopolitical questions?
Absolutely. So I will give a basic primer on Foretell as you call in. And before I do so, I just wanted to note, you've mentioned Adam Siegel a couple of times. Adam Siegel is the CEO of Cultivate Labs, with whom we work on Foretell. Cultivate Labs has created and runs the actual forecasting platform. And Vanessa and Carolyn from Cultivate are on this call as well. So as I understand where ACE and some of those other related projects left off, they showed that crowd forecasting is an effective tool for forecasting a narrow class of questions. And I don't say maybe narrow is the wrong word, but relatively near-term specific questions. The questions have to be rigorously resolvable in order to make them forecastable in this way. And so, the crowd might be good, or super forecasters might be good at predicting, where the GDP of New Jersey will be next year. I don't know if that's a thing. But the bigger picture questions that policymakers are really interested in, like, are the US and China heading toward a Cold War? Or, what is going to happen with US and China decoupling? And how does that relate to export control policy? It's harder to translate those specific, rigorously resolvable forecast questions into something that directly informs those bigger picture questions. And this is not me, this was readily acknowledged by Tetlock and Mellers and their collaborator, Peter Skoblik, in several pieces after ACE, where they really wanted to bridge this gap between the state of the art in forecasting and what was needed for it to be policy relevant. There are a couple of different proposals that have been put out there. One that Tetlock put out is based on what he calls question clusters. And the idea is really very similar to tools we use in other contexts. Many things that we care about are vague, and we can't directly observe them. And so when we want to measure something, we want to study something that's vague, we find proxies, we find metrics, something that we can measure that is a substitute for the thing that we care about but can't measure. And often we identify several metrics and we call that an index. And so Tetlock proposed creating these clusters of related questions that collectively would inform some bigger picture future question relevant to policymakers. And there are different ways to do that. And we're exploring one way to do that. There are many others, and there are many other ways to make these questions policy relevant. So we're really just scratching the surface here. I don't know if I want to get too much in detail about the technical stuff right now, but I'll say that on Foretell, we have two types of questions. I should back up and say the remit is basically CSET's remit. We are trying to inform technology security policy, policy making at the intersection of emerging technologies and national security, with a focus on AI, but not exclusively. There are two types of questions. There are binary questions where we are asking about whether an event will occur. So we'll see in a second, we're going to do some live forecasting. We have a question about whether there will be conflict in the South China Sea between January 1, 2020 and June 30th, January 1, 2021 and June 30th, 2021. And so the answer is yes or no, and the forecasters provide a probability, and the crowd forecast is the average of those probabilities. A second type of question is a type based on continuous historical variables, like New Jersey GDP. I don't know why I'm using that example. And for those questions, we have 5 different bins or intervals that the forecasters forecast. So if you want to know whether New Jersey's GDP will be, I have no idea what New Jersey's GDP is, above $100 million or between 100 and 120 million, you could put a probability on that. If you want to know it'll be between 120 to 150 million, you put a probability on that. And in the end, we get a distribution of probabilities that basically allows us to create a probability distribution function for a continuous historical variable. And these are really interesting questions for a number of reasons. One, we have historical data that can inform our forecast. And so we have a lot of different tools that we can use, that we can provide to the forecasters, and we can try to connect historical trends with where the crowd thinks these trends are going. And so what we're doing is we are trying to create collections of metrics for bigger picture questions that policymakers care about, like where are US-China tensions going. We provide historical data on these questions, and we look for surprises. We look for departures in the historical trends. So what we want to do is we want to identify areas in which a feature of the policy landscape that policymakers should be sensitive to appears to be changing in some way that should make people stop, pause, and reconsider their assumptions. And the assumption is when things are changing quickly, as they appear to be right now, it might be difficult to notice our surprise, to stop as frequently as we ought to, or where we ought to, when things appear to be in flux. So I'll pause there. Did that answer your question, Jason?
Yeah, it did. And it also hopefully gave me the chance to get my audio working. How is this?
It seems great. And I see Rebecca says much better.
Great.
So anyway, just to finish answering that, so what we are working on is what is sometimes referred to as a second generation forecasting method. A way to take forecasts on specific questions and roll them up into some bigger picture question that has broader importance. Before I say more about that, do the limitations of individual forecast questions ring true to you? Is that consistent with your experience of ACE and the policymaker reaction to it?
Yeah, in fact, I think it was one of the critiques by the researchers in ACE that I thought was spot on, and really a failure on my part in figuring out how could we come up with questions that were designed in ACE to get at sort of like key policy issues, because we tended to have these sort of one-off questions rather than building together as clusters. And so that meant that each question, somebody could sort of say like, well, this doesn't seem that policy relevant. And so I think pretty early on, some of the researchers within the ACE program said, is there a way that we can build clusters of questions that will get at key policy debates? And so I think I'm really grateful that you're taking this approach, because I think it will be one in which the results are really relevant. I know one of the other things that we had learned in ACE is that the importance of conditional forecasting questions is really central. I mean, if you're making a decision, what you want to know is sort of like, what's the probability of this thing happening if I take decision X versus decision Y? And the downside of asking conditional questions is that then you're then asking a bunch more questions depending on how many different decisions or actions you're contemplating, and you can start to exhaust even a 20,000 person pool of forecasters. If you start asking 4 conditions per question, you start running out of goodwill in your participant pool. And so that was another thing I think that we confronted early, is that while we wanted to make progress on conditional forecasting questions, it just used up so much space in our sample.
Right.
Have you got sort of thoughts on how we can take on the conditional question?
A couple. So we, first of all, I want to do a live forecasting question, so I'm going to transition to that in a second. I agree 100% about the pros and cons of conditional questions. So far, we've been focusing primarily on non-conditional questions for the reason you mentioned. We have a couple conditional questions right now on the effect of the election on O visas that go to people from China. And the election is an easy context in which to experiment with O visas with conditional questions. And what we've learned is the percentage of O visas, according to the crowd, that will go to people from China is expected to be 22% lower if President Trump is reelected than if Vice President Biden is elected, which accounts to about 300 people at 2019 levels. This might not be an earth-shattering forecast, but I think it's an example of how we can get pretty specific numbers, whether they're accurate or not is another question, by using this method. So what I would like to do is have 2 types of questions to inform these bigger picture questions. One that forecasts where the landscape is going more generally, where we're forecasting, defense investment in AI or commercial success in certain tech sectors, or U.S.-China tensions, or the remote, how remote the tech sector is, which seems to be a trend right now. And then on top of that, we forecast the effect that specific policies will have. So we could forecast, for example, if we add a Chinese company to the entity list, what effect will that have on that company's revenue at the end of the year? And what effect will it have on the revenue or the stock price of the US companies that do business with it? So I know one of the disagreements in that context for export controls is, will this actually have any effect on Chinese companies? Will it instead only negatively impact the US companies? Well, we can forecast that. That's an example of a pretty clean-cut forecast question. Okay, so before, I want to move to questions in a few minutes, but let's do an actual forecast question so folks can see what it looks like. In the interest of time, I'm going to use a binary question, and this one is on the South China Sea. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so everyone watching, actually before I even do that, I'll just show folks. So for all the questions on Foretell, we have this format. There's a question at the top, then there's a fair amount of information here. We'll provide information about related questions, context, information on the data source relied on, which is for the most part a section relevant to the questions based on continuous historical variables, which this is not an example of. And some of the bigger picture scenarios that the question might relate to, because again, most of the questions on Foretell are metrics for these bigger picture questions. So I want everyone to forecast this question. If you don't like your forecast, you can change it afterward. And as you do that, we can see how this number changes. So right now, we're going to take like 2 minutes. So we're at 16%. And this is an example of a question. I'm going to just talk at you, but you can ignore me so you can focus on the question. So this is a binary question. These are not the questions that we are aggregating to inform the bigger picture questions in the feature indices paper that was published today. It's a different kind of question, which is different applications. My hope is that simply knowing the probability of conflict in the South China Sea will be relevant. For example, we know that based upon the data to date, There is I think a 0.6% chance of conflict every week, according to the crowd, for the first half of 2021. And we don't have that many forecasts yet on this question, so we'll see if that number is different after you folks forecast. And we can look at how that changes. It could be that something happens and that number doubles. And if the probability of conflict doubles, that is probably something that policymakers should be aware of. And while folks are finishing their forecast there, I'm just going to show an example of a question based on a continuous historical variable. So this is a question that we just published last week on the trade to GDP ratio for China. Trade to GDP ratio is a common metric for how globalized an economy is. And so this is the information we provide in all of these questions. We'll provide the historical data, and then this is the forecast range. And this is regularly updated in response to forecasts, and you can see where the crowd expects this trend to go.
Michael, this brings to mind something that I really appreciated about what Steve and Adam had done inside the intelligence community, which is that you could see displayed on a graph the anxiety of intelligence analysts. It was sort of like an electrocardiogram for the intelligence community. And I mean, probably more significant even than knowing what the specific probability was just seeing the changes in probabilities. And if you saw this dramatic change, then you could sort of drill down and say, well, you know, what is it that changed a week ago? What information were analysts seeing? Which analysts changed their mind the most? You know, were they analysts who were looking at financial data or you know, narco trafficking data? Could you figure out what was responsible for that shift? And what I really like is that what you're doing allows that sort of same electrocardiogram, but here in the sort of technology and geopolitical space.
Exactly. I mean, I think of this as being one thing I find very useful is to look at the stock price of a company in response to news. If you want to know whether an event will affect Google's bottom line, we have this great ticker that we can look toward. I wish we had something like that for everything. This is a way of basically replicating something like the stock market for other events of policy relevance. While folks finish their forecast here, we're going to transition to some questions in just a minute. Before I do that, I just want to say that Foretell is actually one more response to Jason's comment on the ticker. So this is the paper that we just put out today. I encourage you all to take a look at it. One thing that we do is, so what we're looking at is what we're calling trend departure. And this is the extent to which a trend is expected to deviate from its historical trend. If you look at historical data, you can forecast where a metric is supposed to go using statistical forecasting methods. And then we can look at what the crowd thinks on top of that. And what we're doing here is we're basically trying to quantify the extent to which we should be surprised by where this metric is expected to go. And so this relates to the ticker value, in that in principle, we can look at this surprise factor for historical data points too. We don't need to just use this for the future. So for example, if we look at 2019 here, it's a huge dip. Well, what was the trend departure value for 2019? Well, we can apply the exact same method and we can look at it right here. So the red line is where, according to historical data, this trend should have gone. The blue line is where it actually went. And the difference is the surprise factor, which we can normalize in various ways. And now we're doing that exact same thing using the crowd's data. And we can aggregate these across all the different metrics that we think inform a higher order concept like US-China tensions. Okay, so as we're transitioning to questions, I just want to say this is a pilot project. The project runs through January. Whether we continue it or not is TBD, and it depends a lot on whether this is actually useful to policymakers, analysts, decision makers. There are a lot of different exciting directions we could take it. I'm bullish on scale, I think, for something like this to work. And so if this seems useful or relevant to you, please reach out and let us know how you would use this or what variation on this you'd find most useful. Okay, now let's go to questions. The probability here, by the way, has gone up from, I think, 16% to 21%. So this is a crowd that is more concerned about conflict, which is obviously always concerning. Okay, I'm going to, Rebecca Kagan, my colleague, has been gracious enough to compile some of the questions you folks have put in the chat channel. You can go ahead and add questions to the chat channel, and I'll just sift through these and ask the ones that seem easiest for me. Okay, first question is about kind of downsides and practicalities. And it's about, and some of these questions might be for Jason, some might be for me, we'll just wing it. What has been the reaction to your approach from policy planners and other stakeholders in the intelligence community, State Department, and DoD? Jason, I think I'm particularly interested in your view on this, since you've done this for far longer than I have. I'll say from my perspective, the reaction so far is, that's interesting, but show me specifically how I can use it. And there's a chicken and egg problem that we're wrestling with, in that to really show people specifically how they can use it, we need a large base of forecasters, and ideally we need other people who are using it so we can point to examples. And so I think what we are looking for, and what we have already to some extent, are kind of early champions of this idea that we can work with to generate these proofs of concept. But we're still very much in that we need to show concretely how people can use this tool as a stage.
Yeah, I think what we found in the intelligence community is that there were some policymakers who got this right away and actually sort of expected this when they came in. So people from finance were asking, like, what's the ticker for the probabilities of conflict, and so that group of policymakers was really excited to know that tools like this existed. And then there were some policymakers who, once they discovered that this existed, started to request it. In fact, there were some on the National Security Council who sort of asked for like monthly updates from sort of a roll-up of the questions that we were asking of analysts, and also getting a comparison group outside, because they wanted to know, how do the judgments of intelligence analysts compare to unclassified judgments from non-professionals who are possibly looking at a wider variety of open source data. Because intelligence analysts are just inundated with classified data. It doesn't leave much time to be looking at all the rest. So we found some policymakers who were really plugged into this, and then some who weren't. And I think the challenge there is, how do you get this in front of them, and then get them to sort of expect that intelligence is going to look like this? Again, I think if we can make the tools as easy to use and sort of accessible as possible, it makes it a lot easier. One of the more successful tools inside the intelligence community was a version of Wikipedia called Intellipedia, which is like Wikipedia for classified information. And I think it's like probably the most successful analytic tool that the IC has developed in the last 20 years, even though it's like really straightforward. The way that we describe these sorts of tools is like, this is Intellipedia for the future, right? This is a way of aggregating thousands of people's judgments about future events. And I think most of the challenge in getting sort of adoption for these kinds of techniques is A, familiarity, and B, bureaucratic inertia.
Wonderful. I'll take an easy one that relates very much to what we're doing right now, which is, are you doing anything related to longer term forecasting? So ACE focused on questions that resolved within about a year. And the data, as far as I understand it, shows that the crowd is pretty good on questions that resolve in about a year, and pretty lousy when you get much further out in time, which is a problem because we care about things more than a year out. So with the current approach, what we're doing is we're focusing on scenarios, the bigger picture scenarios, in about a 3 to 7 year time frame, thinking that's kind of a sweet spot for what policymakers care about, but what we can meaningfully say something about. And we are identifying the predictors or trends that we would expect to see in the next year if that scenario were to come about. So if we were going to be in a US-China Cold War in 5 years, what would we expect to see in the next year? And that's what we metricize. So we're focusing on questions that will resolve in the next year in order to inform things that will happen in about 5 years. In principle, it'd be great to go even further out than that, but then we probably need different methods, or we need so many people that we can decompose this into yet another layer, which I think would be challenging. Jason, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just at the level of patience needed by an institution to run like longer term forecasting tournaments, you need like heroic levels of patience. The only two places I've seen do that kind of thing are Phil Tetlock and RAND. The RAND Corporation did like 50-year-long time horizons for technology forecasts prospectively. The other, actually, Melissa Flagg, who's at CSET, funded one of my favorite studies of all time, probably one of Dewey's too, which was this retrospective look at technology forecasts over the last 50 years, and did find that there's like a significant drop off in accuracy over like after about 1 to 2 years out, things start to sort of asymptote towards a coin flip. And I think that sounds right. I mean, I think there's some things like Moore's Law or this, you know, like those kinds of trends that have much longer time horizons where you're likely to be accurate. But most trends, I think, are really difficult to forecast over long time horizons.
Right. There's a question about whether we risk contributing to a general disrespect for experts, which I think is a great question right now, as I think there's probably mounting disrespect for experts in some circles. I'm going to think about my response to that. Jason, do you have off the cuff thoughts?
No, I don't. I mean, it's a good question, but yeah, I'll think more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly in the headlines for the ACE results in Tetlock and Good Judgment Project, there's a lot of interest in, you know, the experts are getting trounced by regular people because it's a fun storyline. But the reality is more complicated than that. You know, there are certain types of questions for which people with subject matter expertise are clearly better. Also, the forecasters are not just non-experts. You know, certain people are much better at forecasting. They are, in some respects, forecasting experts, even if they're not subject matter experts. People exist on a spectrum. So for Foretell, we're trying to find many people, so we can get the numbers, but also people who have experience in relevant fields. And so we're going for a balance between these things. And we're also trying to elicit the forecast of subject matter experts, if nothing else, is a baseline. But ideally, it'd be one of multiple inputs into an all things considered judgment. And so I think while the experts are bad at forecasting, storyline is fun, it's probably not accurate, and there's a more nuanced storyline that I think shows more respect for the experts. Question about how we find forecasters. Well, as I mentioned, right now we are basically trying to get as many forecasters as we can. Cultivate Labs, the company that Adam Siegel runs, is charged with recruiting our forecasters. They've been focusing on graduate schools in relevant fields, international relations, law, business, and they're going out and recruiting people. And we're hoping that events like this will attract more people. There is an application that people fill out, which asks about their background and their areas of expertise. Right now, we're basically allowing everyone to forecast. And we have the ability to filter our forecast pool in the future if the data shows that a subset of our forecaster pool is more accurate. If we get better results if we looked at just their forecast, or we can weight some people more than others. We can weight some people more than others for certain questions, but not others. So there are a lot of options going forward, but we want to begin with just getting as much data as possible. And we will be publishing some analyses soon on accuracy and the crowd relative to some of the subject matter experts.
One point on that, there was this funny effect that happened maybe halfway through the ACE program, which is the intelligence community started receiving applications for, like open positions that listed people's scores in ACE. So people who wanted to become intelligence analysts sort of thought like, well, maybe if I list my accuracy in the ACE program, it'll be like considered a qualification. I would love to live in a world where that was the case, because I think, using these kinds of objective measures for accuracy helps to redefine what expertise means. I mean, expertise, hopefully, if we sort of shift from like just the sort of punditry model to one in which you just happen to be like really, really accurate on a set of questions that are clustered in a particular topic, it would be great in which we had objective measures for that. And then we can use that in order to decide like who we want for a particular role.
I think as far as creating a culture in which these skills are valued, employers looking to whether people have these would be a great first step. So Jason, as an employer in this space, would you look more favorably upon two identical applications if one reflected forecasting skills and the other did not?
I would, and in fact, I think one of the things that we did when we were starting CSET was just sort of ask people if they had participated in ACE, if they had participated with the other forecasting platforms that exist today, what their experience had been. In part, we were also just interested: do people keep score on themselves? Are they kind of like, are they epistemically humble? Do they try to test their own judgments? Figure out where they go wrong, how to do better next time. I think we have, a large number of people who come from that kind of orientation.
Yeah, I think a scenario in which a tool like this really takes off and we have a large number of forecasters is probably one in which different US government employers really value someone who is sufficiently immersed in this area that they're following the news and they're updating their forecasts and they're correcting themselves. And so if you're an employer out there and you want people with those skills, let's find some way to advertise it. We need to wrap up in about a minute. Any final comments from you, Jason?
There's a great question from Stuart Pesco, who is a participant in ACE, about one of the toughest parts of ACE was coming up with good questions. I think it's absolutely right. And one thing I would sort of ask this group is, not only should you consider participating and generating forecasts, but please also consider nominating good questions that you think are important and relevant and amenable to clustering. We really need your help with this.
Absolutely. And right now people can propose questions on Foretell. I should say that the process of taking kind of a fuzzy question and decomposing it into sub-questions and identifying questions for which we have good data is really, really hard and time consuming. And fortunately, I'm working with some folks at OTT, a San Francisco-based nonprofit, on how we can use AI models, language models like GPT-3 to do exactly that. And it's kind of promising. So I think that is one of multiple directions that we could move into that would really help us scale up this kind of work. So that's all the time we have for now. Thank you, Jason, for joining us. Many thanks to all of you for attending and for your thought-provoking questions. Once again, the report is linked on CSET's website, and we appreciate you being with us here today. So stay safe out there.
Thanks, Michael. Great work on this. Take care.
Appreciate it.